Hi, there's one more aspect to parallel routing and wet-dry mixing I want to demonstrate. When a player decides to go with a stereo setup, the attention is often on using stereo effects. And if they're using a wet-dry setup, then it's only natural to scale up to using what's called a wet-dry-wet, or WDW mix. This is where the dry signal is in the center of the stereo field, and the affected or wet signal occupies the left and right channels for a stereo spread. There's another kind of stereo mix to consider that I've found works well, particularly for live situations. It's called the dry-wet-dry, or DWD mix. In this kind of setup, the affected signal's in the center channel, and the dry signal is spread out in stereo using a simple, short delay, also known as the Haas Stereo Effect. Before I show how I set this up, I'll demonstrate the sound of each of these various mixes and what benefits dry-wet-dry may have for a live mix. Here's just the wet-dry mix. Nothing really special about that one, it's just a typical mono sound, but because it uses wet-dry routing, you can also pan the dry and affected sounds a bit more to the side channels like this. That could be great for mixing guitar on a recording, but for live application it's not so great because it would mean the audience would hear a different balance depending on what side of the venue they're sitting. Here's the wet-dry-wet mix. With that one, we only have a stereo mix because the reverb effect is in stereo. The dry signal is mono and it's filling up the center channel. The audience hears the same dry signal regardless of their spot in the venue, but they'll have a different experience hearing the wet signal, with only the people situated in the middle hearing the effect as it's intended. Plus, when different presets are used by the guitar, the stereo field may seem to collapse unless each preset maintains a lot of the same effects that are in stereo. Now hear the dry-wet-dry mix. That mix is also stereo, but it's the dry signal now that's being spread out, while the wet signal's in the center. The audience hears the dry signal and the wet signal in nearly the same way, whether seated on the left or right of the venue, while those seated in the middle will just hear a whiter guitar sound. The center channel is clearer now for placing other instruments like vocals and bass, and no matter what kind of preset is recalled by the guitarist, there will always be a consistency to the stereo spread. I'll play some more varied samples, but first, here's the hookup. It's pretty simple if you're already using a wet-dry mix. All that's needed is to add a delay that can spread the dry signal out in stereo. You could do this on the pedal board itself using an ordinary delay, or a specialized unit like this one from TC Electronics. The amount of delay time is generally around 30 milliseconds, but there's not a rule concerning this. You want enough delay time to separate the signals, but not so much that the delay becomes a distraction. Another option is to continue sending the dry signal to the front of house in mono, and having the stereo spread applied at the mixing console. I prefer to do it all on the pedal board for consistency reasons, and to eliminate the burden on the mixing engineer. Here I've added the pedal to the dry signal, and this is how the dry signal becomes affected. Now I'll do an example that uses a bigger delay effect that's tied rhythmically to what I'm playing. This is the wet-dry-wet mix. And now the dry-wet-dry mix. And here's the sound of the mix with a delay that's used more for soloing. First in wet, dry, wet. And now in dry, wet, dry. Finally, if you have a dry, wet, dry setup, and you are playing a gig that only supports mono, it's a trivial matter to just turn off the stereo spread on the dry signal and use only one channel for that sound.